This emblem up here is a symbol of the Aryan Nations. That is your race. You see that inverted swastika, the sword passing through it. The symbolization of that is the resurrection from the death of our people by Professor Waddell, the great Aryan historian, who said that symbol denoted nothing less than the resurrection and the victory of the Aryan race over the darkness of death and hell.
Richard Butler was an aerospace engineer who retired in the mid-70s and moved to North Idaho with his wife Betty. They bought some property and later changed the mortgage and the deed to Church of Jesus Christ Christian, tried to make their land, their property, a nonprofit church. And that was basically the birth of the Aryan Nations. And by 1981, they burned the first cross there on the property and started holding annual Aryan World Congresses.
Richard Butler was not a person that was dynamic, and he was not a great speaker, but he was quite effective at publicity. And so he was able to get a lot of publicity, not only with national media, but even at times international media. And I think they were fascinated with the idea that he created these two organizations. It was somewhat unique in the sense that his political arm, which was neo-Nazi, or really not the Nazi doctrine, was the political arm, and then to have a religious arm, which was very different from Nazism in Germany when Hitler did not have the religious component. That really resonated with interest with the national media. And so they would come, and he would do two things a year that would draw media. Oftentimes in April he would have a racist skinhead youth conference, and then in July he'd have his so-called World Congress of the Aryan Nations, and he would draw about 300 in the mid-'80s of that each year. They'd come from Canada and all over the United States.
Butler believed in what he called the territorial imperative, that white people should flock to the Northwest and that they should leave the Southwest to Hispanic folks and the Southeast to black people, and I guess the Northeast to Jews. He had this idea that somehow the country, the United States, could be somehow parceled up into different regions where different races and ideologies could live with their like-minded individuals and people with the same color skin and the same belief system. And initially there was a lot of disgust, but there was also a lot of people just didn't want to register an opinion. As long as they don't bother me, I'm not going to bother them. And so they sort of wanted to look the other way, and it's like, well, they're not affecting my lifestyle or my family, so let them do what they want up on their hillside.
The Coeur County Task Force on Human Relations came out of an incident that took place in Hayden, Idaho in December 1980. And it was an incident in which a Jewish restaurant owner was targeted by what was then the Aryan Nations. In the first week of February 1981, we met at the First Christian Church and created what has become known as the Coeur County Task Force on Human Relations, which will next February be 33 years old.
A lot of individuals from throughout the country would, for example, get out of prison, they would hear about Butler, and they would come to Butler's compound from places like Arizona or Texas or wherever, and would live for a short period of time in a bunkhouse that he had there. And he also had an office and a printing press. They would print leaflets. And one of the first things that we saw a lot of were leafleting of neighborhoods in Coeur d'Alene and in Spokane, and they'd print these racist leaflets. Sometimes they would just drop them on the doorsteps, put them under windshields, and people would wonder who's doing this? Why are they distributing this racist literature? And a lot of it would come back to the Aryan Nations. In fact, the Aryans, during their 25-year here, most of the crimes that people that came out of the Aryan Nations compound committed were not committed in this immediate area. They were committed elsewhere. This was their base of operations. They did print counterfeit money there, and there were a couple of murders in North Idaho that were related to racial activities. But for the most part, most of their heinous crimes, including the bombing of synagogues, robbery of armored cars, I mean, the list goes on. I mean, it's unbelievable, really.
White America!
Richard Butler tried a lot of strategies during his years here, and 1998 was the first time that he decided to try a new strategy. The compound where he was up on the rural area is about 15 miles outside our city. And so he finally made that decision that in July that year he wanted to march on the streets of Coeur d'Alene. And it caused a tremendous uproar, and even the city hired attorneys to talk about could they prevent it. And of course, under U.S. Supreme Court decisions, you can't. You have to be content neutral on parades unless some group is going to engage in violence. So he won in court to say that they would have to let him march.
The Spokesman review at one point showing that it was just deplored this sort of racist, put placards in the newspaper that you could put in your door, and it was a black hand shaking a white hand. And people took this placard out of the newspaper and put it in their windows and put it in the back of their cars, and it was all over the place. So when Richard Butler and his neo-Nazis and Klansmen were marching down the streets of Coeur d'Alene on the 5 or 6 parades they held, there were a lot of windows that had those placards in there as a message. The good people of this area don't stand for this sort of hatred.
Between January and July of 1998, our organization became the focal point for all the communities in this area to rally around our strategy. And we did several things between January and July. We announced nationally that we would have a campaign called Lemons to Lemonade. And we asked individuals and organizations if they would pledge money for every minute he marched that we would use as funds to promote diversity in the schools. He marched for 27 minutes in July of 1998. We raised $35,000 for that short time. We received $24,000 of that money, and the other money went to such good organizations as the NAACP.
Victoria and Jason Keenan were passers-by who happened to, late one day, I believe, were driving down the dirt road, Rimrock Road, outside the Aryan compound. They stopped their car for some reason, and some Aryan guards who were armed could see the car and thought that they were some possible intruders, or for some reason decided to give chase to this mother and her son in this rather beat up old car. And so they jumped in a pickup truck, a couple of the guards in the back and a third one driving, and gave chase to Victoria and her son as they drove to the north on a county public road. And they had not trespassed, and in the course of that they fired some shots at the car, striking a tire. It eventually careened into a ditch. Fortunately, there was no one was wounded, or there's no loss of life. The media didn't immediately hear about what had happened, and in fact, to some extent, some people have said that it was almost covered up by law enforcement. But several days later, actually a report was taken by law enforcement, and the incident did surface, and that the media then, several days after the fact, reported that indeed there's been assault, that these guards had gotten wired up and were chasing this car down the road.
Then we found out about it. Mrs. Keenan called me and we talked some days later, and she was devastated, and so we took the case. 2 of the 3 perpetrators were arrested. A third one got away and disappeared, and then they were going to trial criminally. So we decided as an organization through our attorney that we would represent Mrs. Keenan and that this was justified a civil case. And our success was based on the fact that Norm Gissel, our attorney, got to Morris Deeds and Southern Poverty Law Center, took the case and came here. And so, under the great resources of Southern Poverty Law Center, working with our attorney and another attorney named Ken Howard, who was one of Idaho's best civil attorneys, they brought the suit, and in 2000, in a week's trial, the Keenans were awarded $6.3 million. It bankrupted the Aryan Nations. They had to leave the compound, and after a bankruptcy procedure, our victims got all the property. And then a wonderful, wonderful native of Idaho who's known internationally for his human rights work, Greg Carr, came in and purchased the compound from the Keenans, and it's now a peace park.
After the 2000 verdict, Butler was homeless. But some multimillionaires who shared Richard Butler's beliefs stepped forward and bought him a house in Hayden, Idaho, and he continued his church services and continued functioning as the Aryan Nations in a country rancher in suburban Hayden, Idaho. He didn't have his church any longer. He didn't have the bunkhouse and his 20 acres to burn crosses, but they continued having the Aryan World Congress. They actually had their congresses at state parks. They went to different campgrounds and actually continued to burn smaller versions of cross burnings every summer. So right up until the summer of his death, 2004, he continued on with his Aryan World Congresses. So even without his compound, he continued to try and pound the drum of the Aryan Nations. That all ended, I have to tell you, though, pretty much in 2004, in North Idaho at least, with the death of Richard Butler. A lot of people think if they come to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, or to North Idaho, or even to Spokane, but particularly Coeur d'Alene, that they're going to see Nazis marching down the street. You're much more likely probably to see a neo-Nazi or a skinhead, in Los Angeles than you are really in Coeur d'Alene. And yeah, there have been occasions where there have been some Nazi parades, but once the parades were over, they went back. They went back to their under the rock up the road, and so it's not like you see them on the street corners. In fact, if you spent a week in Coeur d'Alene, you'd be hard pressed to find anybody in an Aryan uniform or even wearing an Aryan Nations pin in their lapel. So, but the perception's there, and I do agree to some extent that Idaho has a perception problem, but it's really unfair.
From 1981 until we sat here in 2013, we've had a number of criminal cases in court under Idaho law, prosecuted by our county prosecutor, and then we've had this civil case. And in all that long period of time, we have been successful in every case. We've never gone to court in which we lost a case. In all the criminal cases, the jury brought back verdicts of guilty. How many communities can you recognize that over more than 30 years, they have a 100% conviction rate? And the evidence was there, and they've said, no, you do not commit hate crimes in this area and not face justice, because we will bring the full extent of the law down upon those perpetrators. And that's a wonderful record to talk about.